That morning I woke up and looked out my window to see the most insane sight I'd ever witnessed. A bright pink SUV was trapped inside what looked like a wooden maze, like a rat in some crazy experiment. The woman inside was screaming, banging on her windows, while my grandfather sat on his rocking chair, sipping coffee like nothing unusual was happening. But to understand how Grandpa Walter turned our neighborhood terror into the laughingstock of the entire town, we need to go back 3 months earlier, when Brenda first showed up at our ranch gate with the face of someone ready to devour us whole. Comment down below where you're watching from, and whether you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen like this one. Our family's ranch had been sitting pretty on the outskirts of Millbrook, Texas since 1962, long before any fancy subdivisions or homeowner associations existed. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across 47 acres of prime Texas hill country, complete with rolling pastures, a red barn that had weathered countless storms, and a main house that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. My dad, Preston, had been managing the place since Grandpa Walter retired from his 40-year career as a civil engineer. And life was peaceful until that fateful Tuesday morning when everything changed forever. I was helping Dad fix some old wooden fence posts along the eastern boundary when we heard the screech of brakes and the slam of a car door that sounded like a gunshot in the morning quiet. A bright pink Honda Pilot had pulled up right in front of our gate, and out stepped the most aggressively dressed woman I'd ever seen in my 23 years of life. She wore a hot pink tracksuit that could probably be seen from space, oversized fake designer sunglasses, and carried a matching pink clipboard like it was some kind of medieval weapon designed specifically for bureaucratic warfare. Her bleach blonde hair looked like it had been styled with a leaf blower and industrial-strength hairspray, creating a gravity-defying monument to bad taste that somehow stayed perfectly in place despite the Texas wind. She had enough fake jewelry hanging off her to set off a metal detector from 50 feet away, and her hot pink fingernails were so long they could probably be classified as weapons. The woman introduced herself with all the authority of someone announcing World War III. "I'm Brenda Williamson, chairman of the Highland Estates Homeowners Association, and duly appointed enforcement officer with full legal authority to ensure compliance with all community standards and regulations." Dad looked at her with confused expression, like someone had started speaking ancient Sumerian in our driveway. "Ma'am," Dad said in his polite Texas drawl, "I think there might be some confusion here. This is the Henderson Ranch, and we've been here long before any homeowner association existed." But Brenda wasn't having any reasonable talk. She immediately launched into a tirade about our numerous and egregious violations of HOA regulations, waving that pink clipboard around like she was conducting an orchestra from hell. According to her extensive list, our natural wood fence didn't fit the aesthetic vision because it was too rustic and needed approved HOA colors. The traditional red barn paint was too bright and gaudy for community standards. We had excessive agricultural equipment visible from the public road, which apparently included our perfectly functional John Deere tractor that had sat in the same spot for 15 years. Our mailbox was apparently 3 inches too tall. The gravel in our driveway was the wrong color and needed replacement with approved materials. The mature oak trees along our front boundary were casting shadows on neighbors' property and needed trimming to appropriate specifications. And somehow, even our chickens in the backyard constituted a serious nuisance violation because their clucking could potentially disturb community peace. This woman had problems with everything from our roof shingles to how we parked our vehicles. Dad tried explaining that the Henderson Ranch had been here since 1962, decades before Highland Estates subdivision existed, and we had grandfathered rights to maintain our property as we saw fit. But Brenda just clapped her hands and let out this awful laugh that sounded like a hyena having a nervous breakdown. "Listen here, honey. I don't care if this little hobby farm is older than Moses himself. Current law is current law, and I'm here to enforce it with full authority of the Highland Estates Homeowners Association, period." The way she said little hobby farm made it sound like something she'd scrape off her designer shoes. That's when Grandpa Walter appeared on the front porch like a gunslinger in an old western, coffee mug in hand, watching the whole scene with the kind of calm intensity that made smart people nervous and stupid people overconfident. He didn't say a word, just stood there in his faded jeans and worn cowboy boots, taking it all in with those sharp engineer's eyes that had supervised construction of bridges, office buildings, and highways across 3 states during his career. Brenda kept ranting about property values and community standards while waving legal documents around. completely oblivious to being studied like a specimen under a microscope. She finally delivered her ultimatum with dramatic flair of someone announcing the apocalypse. 7 days to rectify all violations and bring this property into full compliance with Highland Estates community standards, or face fines of $500 per day for each violation until complete. She handed Dad a manila folder thick with papers and regulations, then added with obvious satisfaction, "And don't think about fighting this in court, because I have full backing of our legal team and authority of Texas state law behind me." Dad looked at his father with helpless eyes, clearly not knowing what to do next in the face of such bureaucratic insanity. But as Brenda climbed back into her pink monstrosity and drove off with country music blasting loud enough to wake the dead, something fundamental changed in Grandpa's expression. He set down his coffee cup on the porch railing with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. And slowly, like sunrise breaking over the horizon, a mysterious smile began to spread across his weathered face. It was the kind of smile that had probably appeared 40 years ago when he figured out how to solve some impossible engineering problem. And I had the distinct feeling that Brenda Williamson had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Dad and Grandpa decided to try the peaceful route first, thinking maybe if we made some cosmetic changes, this crazy woman would leave us alone and find someone else to terrorize. Boy, were we wrong about that. We started the next morning by repainting the wooden fence with something called Sierra Sunset Beige that matched the HOA's approved color palette, a shade so bland and generic it could cure insomnia just by looking at it. Dad figured if we showed good faith effort, maybe Brenda would back off and find something better to do with her time. That optimism lasted exactly 24 hours. Brenda showed up every single morning at exactly 9 o'clock sharp, like some kind of terrible alarm clock designed specifically to ruin our day. She'd park that pink SUV in the exact same spot right at the edge of our property line and march over with her clipboard and camera, always finding new and increasingly ridiculous reasons to make our lives miserable. Day one, after we finished painting, she complained that the beige didn't match the exact shade specified in Section 4.7 of the community guidelines, and that we'd need to repaint everything again with the correct tint. Day two, she decided that having our old John Deere tractor visible from the road violated regulations about unsightly agricultural equipment display and needed to be moved to a location where it couldn't be seen by passing traffic. Never mind that the tractor had been sitting in that same spot for 15 years and was essential for maintaining our property. Day three brought complaints about the grass height in one corner of our property, which she claimed exceeded maximum height tolerance by 2.5 inches, according to subsection 12.4 of the landscaping standards. She actually got down on her hands and knees with a ruler to measure individual blades of grass, like some sort of demented scientist. I started noticing that Grandpa was keeping incredibly detailed notes every time Brenda visited, writing down exact arrival and departure times, duration of visits, specific complaints made, photographic evidence of her behavior, and even detailed descriptions of what color of pink outfit she wore each day. The woman had an entire wardrobe of hot pink clothes, from tracksuits to business suits to what looked like pink cowboy boots that cost more than some people's cars. It was like she'd made a conscious decision to dress like a walking traffic cone every single day of her life. Dad was getting more stressed and frustrated by the day, snapping at Mom and me over little things that normally wouldn't bother him. Mom started staying up late at night, worrying about the mounting fines that Brenda kept threatening to impose if we didn't achieve complete compliance with her ever-expanding list of violations. We had several family meetings around the kitchen table where Dad wanted to hire a lawyer immediately and fight back through the courts. But Grandpa just shook his head and said in that calm, measured voice of his, "Son, patience is a virtue, and sometimes the best offense is a well-planned defense." Things escalated significantly when Brenda started bringing a professional-looking camera and began taking photos of every inch of our property like some kind of amateur private investigator gathering evidence for a federal case. She'd measure the height of grass with a ruler, check the exact angles of fence posts with a level, examine paint coverage with a magnifying glass, and generally act like she was documenting war crimes instead of normal ranch maintenance activity. She even brought a clipboard with detailed sketches and measurements, creating what looked like a military intelligence dossier on our family's daily routine. The harassment became so systematic and aggressive that she started parking her SUV right at the edge of our property line every morning, positioning herself to have the best possible view of our daily activities. She'd sit there for hours, watching through binoculars like she was conducting surveillance on enemy territory. What she didn't realize was that Grandpa was watching her just as carefully, noting her patterns, her timing, her blind spots, and most importantly, exactly where she chose to park every single day. The tension in our household reached a dangerous level when Brenda brought what she called her documentation specialist, which turned out to be her cousin Daryl, wielding a video camera and trying to look official in a wrinkled suit that was 2 sizes too small. They spent an entire afternoon filming our violations and making threatening comments about legal action, while standing just inches outside our property line. Dad finally lost his temper and started arguing with them, his voice getting louder and more frustrated as Brenda kept interrupting him with legal jargon and threats. That's when Grandpa calmly intervened, placing a gentle hand on Dad's shoulder and suggesting he go inside to cool off before things got out of hand. After Dad stomped into the house, Grandpa stood there, facing Brenda and her camera-wielding cousin with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of dealing with difficult people and impossible situations. He didn't say much, just looked at them with those engineering eyes and smiled that mysterious smile that was starting to make me nervous. After that particularly heated confrontation, I noticed Grandpa disappearing into the basement for long periods of time, and when I went down to check on him, I found him spreading out old architectural blueprints on his workbench, sketching something new with the focused intensity of someone planning a major construction project. The drawings were covered with precise measurements, angles, and notations in his careful engineer's handwriting. When I asked what he was working on, he just patted my shoulder and said, "Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to approach it from an angle nobody expects." That night, I could hear him moving around down there until well past midnight, the soft scratch of pencil on paper mixing with the occasional satisfied chuckle that told me he was definitely up to something big. Monday morning brought a whole new level of insanity when Brenda arrived wearing what could only be described as a power suit designed by someone with a severe allergy to subtlety. The bright red blazer and matching skirt combination was paired with white patent leather boots that had heels so high they qualified as architectural features. And she'd somehow managed to make her hair even bigger and more aggressive than usual. She wasn't alone this time. She'd brought 2 men she introduced as her legal assistants, though they looked more like her redneck cousins who'd been shoehorned into ill-fitting blazers purchased from the clearance rack at a discount store. With great ceremony and obvious relish, she served us with what she called official legal documentation regarding a $5,000 fine for continuous and willful violations of Highland Estates community covenants and binding residential agreements. The fine was accompanied by the threat of placing a lien on our property if we didn't pay within 30 days, along with additional daily fines that would continue to accumulate until we achieved what she called full compliance with all applicable standards and regulations. She waved a stack of papers around like she was conducting a legal symphony, claiming it was comprehensive documentation supporting all her actions and demands. Dad absolutely lost his mind, shouting about harassment and unfairness and demanding to know where she got the authority to impose such ridiculous fines on property that predated her subdivision by decades. His face turned red and his voice cracked with frustration as he gestured wildly at the papers, calling the whole thing a scam and threatening to call the real police to report extortion and harassment. Brenda immediately pulled out her phone and started recording everything, claiming this was clear evidence of threatening and aggressive behavior from a non-compliant resident who refuses to accept legitimate legal authority. That's when Grandpa stepped in with the smooth grace of a diplomat diffusing an international incident. He gently guided Dad back toward the house, speaking in low, calming tones while Dad continued to rant about the injustice of the whole situation. Once Dad was safely inside and away from Brenda's camera, Grandpa returned to face our pink-clad tormentor in what felt like a showdown at high noon in an old Western movie. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as these 2 very different people sized each other up like gunfighters, preparing for battle. Grandpa's voice stayed soft and measured, but there was unmistakable steel beneath the surface when he said, "Miss Williamson, are you absolutely certain you want to escalate this particular game with me?" His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but something in his eyes made it clear this wasn't really a question so much as a warning. Brenda puffed herself up like an angry toad and shot back with venom dripping from every word. "Listen here, old man. I don't know who you think you are, but I have the full backing of the Highland Estates Board of Directors and complete legal authority to enforce these regulations. You can't intimidate me with your frontier tough guy routine." Grandpa's smile turned cold and dangerous, the kind of expression that probably made smart contractors nervous when he was reviewing their work back in his engineering days. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to intimidate anyone. I'm simply informing you that I might have a few resources and connections of my own that you haven't taken into consideration." The conversation took an unexpected and dramatic turn when Grandpa casually mentioned that he'd taken the time to verify certain details about her residential status and discovered some interesting facts about her actual legal address. It turned out that Grandpa had done his homework with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. He'd spent time at the county courthouse, made some phone calls to old friends in various offices, and discovered that Brenda was actually living in a run-down apartment complex called Sunset Manor on the other side of town, not even close to being a resident of the Highland Estates community she claimed to represent with such authority. In fact, her legal residence was more than 15 miles away from our ranch, which raised serious questions about her standing to enforce HOA regulations on our property. For a moment, Brenda looked genuinely stunned, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the panic that flashed across her face like lightning, but she recovered quickly, with renewed viciousness and desperation, her voice rising to a screech that probably violated several noise ordinances. "You miserable old fool! You have no idea what kind of connections I have in this town. I'm going to destroy everything you hold dear. I'll make sure this pathetic excuse for a ranch gets bulldozed and turned into a parking lot." Her threats became increasingly wild and specific, including promises to have us audited by the IRS, investigated by health inspectors, and harassed by every regulatory agency she could think of. As Brenda and her legal team stormed off in their pink chariot of bureaucratic rage, Grandpa just stood there calmly watching them go, his expression unreadable but somehow deeply satisfied. That evening I found him in the basement again, this time with his old surveying equipment spread out on the table, alongside detailed property maps, legal documents, and what looked like construction blueprints that were becoming more complex and detailed by the day. When I asked what he was working on, he just patted my shoulder with that engineering precision of his and said, "Sometimes, grandson, the best way to deal with a bully is to let them dig their own grave while you provide the shovel. We're just going to help that process along a little bit." The next few days, I noticed Grandpa making phone calls to people he hadn't spoken to in years, pulling in favors from his 4 decades in the construction and engineering business. He had contacts in city planning offices, county surveyor departments, and legal firms across the state, people who remembered Walter Henderson as someone who got things done right the first time and didn't put up with nonsense from anyone. I could tell he was building something, but it wasn't just the mysterious construction project in our yard. He was building a case, gathering allies, and preparing for a battle that Brenda had no idea was coming. The next phase of Grandpa's plan began with what seemed like innocent property maintenance activities, but I was starting to realize that nothing Walter Henderson did was ever quite as simple as it appeared on the surface. He started ordering supplies from Cedar Grove Lumber with very specific requirements. Exact measurements for wooden panels, particular types of galvanized hardware, specialized corner brackets, and enough materials to build what looked like a small village. The delivery trucks started showing up almost daily, bringing loads of carefully measured lumber that Grandpa personally inspected with the attention to detail of someone building a space shuttle. He began what he called routine fence maintenance, working on sections at seemingly random locations around our property boundary. What made it strange was that these weren't the areas that actually needed repair, and the new sections didn't quite connect to the existing fence line in any obvious pattern. The work was incredibly precise, with every measurement double-checked and every angle verified with professional surveying equipment that he'd retrieved from storage in the barn. When Dad or I asked about the purpose of these seemingly disconnected fence sections, Grandpa would just smile and say, "Trust your old man, boys. Sometimes patience and preparation catch much bigger fish than rushing in with nets and hooks." Meanwhile, Brenda responded to the increased construction activity by bringing what she dramatically called her security detail, which consisted of 2 beer-bellied gentlemen named Daryl and Bobby Joe, who wore mismatched camouflage clothing and tried way too hard to look intimidating. They drove a rusty pickup truck with Confederate flag bumper stickers and positioned themselves as Brenda's personal bodyguards, though they spent most of their time drinking energy drinks and playing games on their phones while trying to look menacing. Brenda established what she called a comprehensive surveillance routine, parking her pink SUV in the exact same spot every morning from 9 to 11 o'clock, then leaving for what we later learned was a standing appointment at the Glam Palace nail salon downtown, where she spent 2 hours getting her nails done in various shades of aggressive pink. She'd return around 1:30 with fresh nail extensions and renewed determination to make our lives miserable, staying until about 4 o'clock when she'd leave to pick up dinner from various drive-through restaurants. Grandpa studied her patterns with the methodical precision of a military intelligence officer planning a complex operation. He noted the exact timing of her arrivals and departures, her behavioral tics and habits, the blind spots in her surveillance position, and most importantly, the precise location where she chose to park that pink monstrosity every single day. He even started keeping a detailed log of her activities, complete with photographs and timestamps, building what looked like a comprehensive dossier on our neighborhood nemesis. The construction work became more intense and systematic as days passed. Grandpa would spend hours measuring specific areas around Brenda's regular parking spot, using professional levels and measuring tapes, while pretending to address what he called drainage issues along the property line. He was operating with the precision and attention to detail that had made him one of the most respected civil engineers in Texas during his career, and every measurement seemed to serve a purpose that only he fully understood. The wooden panels he was installing weren't quite like anything I'd seen before. They were exactly 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and built with interlocking hardware that allowed them to be connected at various angles. Each panel was treated with weather-resistant coating and fitted with specialized brackets that could be quickly assembled into different configurations. It was like he was building some kind of modular fence system, but the purpose remained completely mysterious to everyone except Grandpa himself. Brenda grew increasingly paranoid and agitated as the construction project expanded. She started filming every move Grandpa made, accusing him of psychological warfare and planning something highly suspicious that violated multiple community regulations. She'd march over with her camera rolling, demanding detailed explanations of every nail, board, and bracket. But since Grandpa was technically just maintaining his own property within all legal parameters, there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop him. The confrontations became more frequent and heated as both sides dug in for what was obviously becoming a serious battle of wills. Brenda would march across the yard with her entourage of wannabe bodyguards, demanding to know exactly what Grandpa was building and threatening legal action if he didn't provide complete blueprints and specifications. Grandpa would respond with the patient voice of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child, saying things like, "Ma'am, I'm simply making some improvements to my fence line. Property maintenance is perfectly legal in this state last time I checked the relevant statutes." Our neighbors started taking notice of the daily drama unfolding in our front yard, and surprisingly, most of them began showing quiet support for our family's resistance to Brenda's tyrannical behavior. Byron Montgomery, an elderly gentleman who lived down the road and had dealt with his own share of HOA harassment, offered to loan tools and even volunteered to help with the construction project. Cecilia Walsh, the HOA secretary who had endured years of Brenda's abuse and micromanagement, began accidentally sharing information about Brenda's latest schemes and the growing dissatisfaction among Highland Estates residents. As the days passed and more fence sections appeared in strategic locations around our property, it became increasingly clear that Grandpa was working towards some kind of master plan that none of us could quite figure out. The construction was too precise and purposeful to be random maintenance, and the careful attention to measurements and angles suggested an engineering project of significant complexity. Whatever he was building, it was definitely more sophisticated and strategic than anything Brenda and her pink-clad army could comprehend. Brenda decided it was time to bring in what she called serious legal firepower in the form of Quentin Barnes, a bottom-feeder attorney whose office was conveniently located in a strip mall between a payday loan place and a tire shop that advertised, "We finance anyone." Barnes looked exactly like the kind of lawyer you'd find in a late-night television commercial, complete with a cheap suit, slick-back hair, and the kind of smile that made you want to count your wallet after shaking his hand. Together, they represented everything that was wrong with the modern legal system. Petty tyrants armed with just enough legal knowledge to be dangerous. They showed up one morning with a temporary restraining order that they waved around like a battle flag, demanding that Grandpa cease all construction activities immediately or face contempt of court charges and possible arrest. Brenda was practically dancing with glee at what she obviously considered her masterstroke, finally having found a way to stop whatever mysterious project Grandpa was working on. Barnes puffed himself up like a rooster in a henhouse, delivering what he probably thought was an intimidating speech about property rights, community standards, and the serious legal consequences of violating court orders. Grandpa examined the documents with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent decades reviewing construction contracts and legal specifications for major engineering projects. After reading through the entire restraining order twice, he let out a small chuckle that seemed to deflate Barnes' confidence like a pin popping a balloon. "Mr. Barnes," Grandpa said in his measured engineer's voice, "did your client happen to inform you that all this construction is taking place entirely on private property, with proper setbacks, approved permits, and full compliance with all applicable building codes?" What followed was a legal skirmish that Barnes was clearly not prepared for and had probably never encountered in his career of handling slip-and-fall cases and small claims disputes. He tried to argue about spite fences and intentional nuisance construction, throwing around legal terms he'd obviously looked up the night before in hopes of intimidating a simple rancher. But Grandpa calmly produced a folder containing survey documents, property deeds, detailed architectural plans, building permits that had been approved by the county, and photographs showing every stage of construction in full compliance with local regulations. You could see the exact moment when Barnes realized he was completely outmatched by someone with actual legal knowledge and 40 years of experience dealing with complex property regulations. The lawyer started sweating through his polyester suit and frantically flipping through his papers, looking for some angle that might save his case and his reputation. Meanwhile, Brenda stood behind him making increasingly desperate demands and threats, her voice rising to a pitch that could probably shatter windows and definitely violated several noise ordinances. When the legal route failed spectacularly, Brenda decided to escalate things by calling the sheriff's department, claiming that Grandpa was building unsafe and unauthorized structures without proper permits, in clear violation of county building codes. She made it sound like he was constructing a nuclear reactor in the front yard instead of installing some fence panels on his own property. Officer Garrett Thompson showed up 30 minutes later, took one look at the perfectly legal fence construction work, and started laughing while shaking hands with Grandpa like they were old friends. Thompson was a good man who had known our family for years and wasn't about to be fooled by Brenda's dramatics or Barnes' legal theatrics. He'd probably dealt with dozens of similar HOA disputes over the years and could spot a frivolous complaint from a mile away. Grandpa showed him the detailed blueprints and construction specifications, explaining the project as routine property improvement designed to enhance privacy and security. Thompson nodded approvingly at the craftsmanship and careful planning involved, even complimenting Grandpa on the quality of the work and attention to building codes. Brenda's meltdown reached truly epic proportions when she realized that even the county authorities couldn't help her stop Grandpa's mysterious construction project. She accused Thompson of being part of some vast conspiracy, claimed that Grandpa was engaging in psychological torture and planning something sinister that threatened the safety and property values of the entire community. Her accusations became increasingly wild and desperate, including claims that we were building some kind of fortress, planning to start a cult, or preparing to declare independence from the United States. That's when Grandpa made what seemed like a casual announcement that would soon prove to be anything but casual. He mentioned to Officer Thompson that the construction project would be completed within the next 24 hours, and everything would become clear very soon. Something in his tone and the way he said it made everyone pay closer attention, and I could see a flicker of understanding begin to dawn in Thompson's eyes. Whatever Grandpa had been planning all these weeks, the endgame was approaching fast. In a final act of desperate defiance that would prove to be the biggest mistake of her campaign against our family, Brenda decided to take what she called direct action to prevent the completion of whatever Grandpa was building. She announced that she would park her SUV directly in front of our gate and refuse to move until he agreed to tear down all the fence sections and pay the accumulated fines that now totaled over $15,000. She declared this her final stand and dared Grandpa to try anything while I'm here protecting the community from his illegal activities. That evening, as Brenda sat in her pink Portress, making phone calls to reporters and anyone else who would listen to her complaints, Grandpa worked late into the night making final preparations for what I was beginning to realize would be the most spectacular conclusion to any neighborhood dispute in Texas history. When I asked if there was anything I could do to help, he just smiled that mysterious engineer's smile and said, "Tomorrow morning is going to be very educational indeed, grandson. I think Miss Williamson is about to learn an important lesson about the difference between tactics and strategy." Dawn broke over Millbrook County, with the promise of what would become the most legendary day in our family's history, though none of us, except Grandpa, really understood what was about to unfold. Brenda had positioned herself in her usual parking spot with the determination of a general defending a strategic fortress, her bright pink Honda Pilot angled to block the most direct access to our ranch gate. She sat there with grim satisfaction written across her heavily made-up face like war paint, convinced that she had finally outmaneuvered us and would force Grandpa to surrender to her demands. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect for construction work, and Grandpa emerged from the house at exactly 6 o'clock, accompanied by Dad and a crew of experienced carpenters from town who had worked with him on various projects over the years. These weren't random hired hands. They were skilled craftsmen who understood Grandpa's exacting standards and had the experience to execute complex construction projects with military precision. The team moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine, everyone knowing their role and responsibilities without needing detailed instructions. I positioned myself on the front porch with a cup of coffee, sensing that I was about to witness something extraordinary and wanting to have the best possible view of whatever was going to happen. The construction crew began unloading the final components of Grandpa's mysterious project from a large truck that had arrived before sunrise, revealing wooden panels, connecting hardware, and specialized brackets that had obviously been custom manufactured for this specific purpose. Everything was labeled with numbers and letters in Grandpa's careful handwriting, like pieces of a complex puzzle waiting to be assembled. Within the first hour, the purpose of all those seemingly random fence sections became brilliantly clear as the crew began connecting them with additional panels to create an elaborate geometric pattern around the entire front area of our property. Grandpa directed the operation like a symphony conductor, his engineering background evident in every gesture and instruction as the wooden maze began to take shape according to some predetermined design that only he fully understood. Brenda was initially too absorbed in her phone calls to pay much attention to the construction happening around her. She was busy threatening lawsuits, trying to call in favors from various city officials, and giving interviews to local reporters who had started showing up to cover what was becoming a major local news story. The sound of hammering and drilling had become such a constant background noise over the past weeks that she probably thought it was just more of the same routine maintenance work that she'd been unsuccessfully trying to stop. By 9 o'clock, the construction had accelerated dramatically, with multiple crews working simultaneously on different sections of what was clearly becoming a complex labyrinth of interconnected wooden walls. The panels were exactly 6 feet high and designed to create a maze that extended in all directions from a central point, with pathways that twisted and turned in seemingly random patterns but were obviously planned with mathematical precision. The craftsmanship was impeccable, with every joint fitting perfectly and every angle measured to the exact degree. That's when Brenda finally looked up from her phone and experienced what could only be described as a moment of pure existential horror. Her bright pink Honda Pilot was completely surrounded by an elaborate maze of interconnected fence panels, creating a geometric prison with no visible escape route and walls too high to drive over. The only entrance to the maze had been inadvertently sealed by the final panel that was being installed, even as she watched in growing panic and disbelief. The realization of what had happened hit her like a freight train loaded with karma. Grandpa had masterfully created a complex three-dimensional puzzle around her vehicle, with walls positioned to prevent any possible exit while maintaining the appearance of legitimate property improvement rather than an obvious trap. The maze was beautiful in its way, like a piece of functional art that served multiple purposes: property enhancement, privacy barrier, and poetic justice, delivery system all rolled into one engineering masterpiece. The panic that set in was immediate and spectacular, like watching someone realize they're trapped in their worst nightmare. Brenda tried frantically to reverse her SUV, gunned the engine until it screamed in protest, honked her horn in increasingly desperate bursts, and finally began screaming at the top of her lungs as she realized that her pink fortress had become her pink prison. She rolled down her windows and started yelling threats and curses that would make a drill sergeant proud, demanding that someone immediately tear down the walls and release her vehicle. Grandpa leisurely approached the maze with his morning coffee mug in hand, his expression the picture of innocent surprise as he peered through one of the strategic gaps in the fence panels. "Oh my goodness, Miss Williamson," he called out in a voice dripping with mock concern. "I had no idea you were still parked inside our construction zone. How terribly inconvenient this must be for you." His tone was perfectly polite and helpful, but his eyes held a glint of deep satisfaction that made the whole scene even more beautiful to witness. The gathering crowd of neighbors, construction workers, and arriving news crews watched in amazement as the full scope of Grandpa's plan became clear. This wasn't just revenge, it was performance art, engineering excellence, and perfect timing all combined into one unforgettable moment that would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. Officer Thompson arrived after receiving multiple calls about a disturbed woman screaming in a parking lot and found himself looking at a scene that was both hilarious and completely legal. Every single measurement had been calculated to ensure that the maze was constructed entirely on Henderson property, with Brenda's vehicle trapped inside solely through her own choice to park in that specific location, day after day. The genius of the plan was that it used her own predictable behavior against her, turning her surveillance routine into the very thing that made her downfall possible. She had literally parked herself into a corner, and now she was facing the consequences of her campaign against our family. The immediate aftermath of the maze incident was chaos in the best possible way, like watching years of frustration finally resolve into perfect poetic justice. Brenda spent the next hour screaming demands and calling everyone from her lawyer to the governor of Texas while trapped inside her wooden prison. Meanwhile, word spread through Millbrook faster than gossip at a church social, and soon we had reporters from 3 local news stations and half the population of Highland Estates taking pictures of Brenda's pink SUV trapped inside Grandpa's geometric masterpiece. The story captured people's imagination immediately because it represented everything they'd ever wanted to do to petty tyrants but never had the courage or creativity to attempt. Grandpa handled the media attention with characteristic humility, explaining to reporters that he'd simply been exercising his property rights and had no idea Miss Williamson would choose to park inside his construction zone. When pressed for details about planning such an elaborate project, he just smiled and said, "40 years of engineering teaches you to think ahead and prepare for contingencies." But the maze incident triggered something much more significant than just local entertainment. The intense media scrutiny revealed that several Highland Estates residents had been suffering under Brenda's tyrannical rule for years, but had been too intimidated to speak up. The publicity gave people courage to come forward with their own stories of harassment, illegal fines, and suspicious financial practices. Cecilia Walsh, who had endured years of Brenda's psychological abuse as HOA secretary, finally decided she'd had enough and came forward with boxes of evidence she'd been secretly collecting. The documents included forged signatures on official HOA documents, suspicious financial transfers between association accounts and Brenda's personal accounts, inflated invoices from contractors who turned out to be Brenda's relatives, and recordings of Brenda bragging about manipulating association finances to fund her lifestyle. The investigation revealed systematic embezzlement and financial fraud going back over 2 years, with estimated theft exceeding $50,000 from Highland Estates community funds. Detective Maria Santos discovered that Brenda had been creating fake vendor contracts, billing the HOA for services never performed, and funneling money through shell companies to hide the stolen funds. The irony was perfect. While obsessing over fence paint colors and grass height, she'd been systematically stealing from the very people she claimed to protect from property value decline. The arrest happened at the most cinematically perfect moment possible, right in front of the maze while Brenda was giving an interview to Channel 7 News, ranting about Grandpa's criminal harassment. Detective Santos and 2 uniformed officers approached with handcuffs just as Brenda reached the crescendo of her victim narrative. The look of absolute shock on her heavily made-up face was worth more than any revenge fantasy could ever provide, and screamed about conspiracy theories, and accused everyone from Grandpa to the police of plotting to destroy her reputation. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. That evening, Grandpa revealed the final twist in his carefully orchestrated plan. He admitted he'd suspected Brenda's financial crimes from the very beginning of her harassment campaign. Her behavior had been too aggressive and desperate to be just about property standards. It had hallmarks of someone trying to distract attention from bigger problems. "You see," Grandpa explained with satisfaction, I started keeping detailed records not just for our protection, but because something didn't add up about her whole operation. Real HOA enforcement follows procedures and works through proper channels. Brenda was making it personal, which suggested motivations beyond just enforcing community standards. He'd been working quietly with Cecilia Walsh and Officer Thompson for weeks, gathering evidence, while the fence maze served as both distraction and a way to keep Brenda's attention focused on our family instead of covering her tracks. The construction project had been carefully timed to coincide with the investigation, ensuring maximum impact when everything came together. The epilogue was everything our family could have hoped for. Brenda pled guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, plus full restitution to the Highland Estates community. The HOA elected a new board committed to fair governance, immediately canceling all ridiculous fines and violations Brenda had imposed during her reign of terror. Highland Estates residents passed a resolution, officially thanking our family and declaring Grandpa an honorary community member. Grandpa decided to keep the fence maze as permanent addition to our property, adding a small bronze plaque reading Highland Estates Memorial Garden, dedicated to community spirit and the power of patient planning. The maze became a tourist attraction, with visitors coming from across Texas to see where justice had been served, with engineering precision and perfect timing. Every morning now, I watch Grandpa sit on the front porch in his rocking chair, sipping coffee and surveying his geometric masterpiece with deep satisfaction. When visitors ask how he came up with such a perfect plan, he always gives the same answer. 40 years of building bridges teaches you that the strongest structures are built on solid foundations, with patience and precision. Sometimes that applies to more than just construction projects. The fence maze stands today as testament that wisdom, careful planning, and community spirit will always triumph over petty tyranny and corruption.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.